Working is presented by Maya Strategy Group, a leading market research and strategy consulting firm, helping clients in the pet care and animal health industries navigate strategic challenges for almost 2 decades. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pet Working. I'm Peter Kenseth, Vice President and Partner at Strategy Group, and I am here today with Darren Vanstone, Managing Director of Ocatra. Ocatra is a global network of independent consultants. They operate all over the world and advise companies, organizations, brands on responsible sourcing, animal welfare, sustainable food works, supply chain. They have done a lot of work with the Pet Sustainability Coalition, which is where I met Darren at the Impact Unleashed conference a couple of years ago. Looking forward to that, the next iteration of that next summer. But we're going to have a great conversation today around sustainability in pet food. Obviously, just like everything else, sustainability in pet food matters. I always like to tell people if you took the dogs and cats in the US alone and put their meat consumption together, they would actually be the 5th largest meat consuming country in the world. And that's just our pets. So there's certainly a lot of room for pet food companies to move the needle when it comes to sustainable sourcing, reducing the impact that pet food production has on our climate, and improving animal welfare and ethical and sustainable sourcing and how we get meat from the pasture into our pet food. So Darren, without further ado, you are far more the expert in this than I am. Thanks so much for being here and welcome to Pet Working.
Well, thanks for having me. And I feel like you've covered it all. So this has been a good chat.
we can set a record for the all-time shortest episode of Pet Working.
Exactly.
Stop it now. We'll see how well 2-minute episodes draw traffic compared to our usual 30 to 45 minutes. But I feel like you have a lot of valuable stuff to say, so I'm not going to let you off that easy. You and I have talked a lot about this at Global Pet, at Super Zoo. It was obviously, the focus of Impact Unleashed. There are real challenges when it comes to sustainability in pet food, and that's everything from sourcing to packaging. And you're more focused on the sourcing and supply. There are definite, pet food brands can and are taking to make their product environmentally friendly, more sustainable. And I don't think it takes too much at this point to look around and see what's happening. We just had the back-to-back hurricanes in Florida with Helene and Milton. We have seen wildfires in Hawaii. We've seen wildfires across California, across Canada. We've seen bleaching of the coral reefs. I don't know really what more has to be done to prove to people that are not convinced of climate science and the existence of climate change that we are reaching a tipping point if we haven't reached it already. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to do what we can to stop the tide and to reverse it. And the pet food industry is not exempt from that. So where we can make choices to adopt more carbon-friendly, carbon-neutral sources of protein, where we can move to more reusable, recyclable packaging, those things need to be done. That being said, we don't necessarily see, we see lots of brands leaning into sustainability initiatives, but I think the big debate around sustainability is often, is it actually a purchase driver? Am I getting, is there the economic incentive there to get brands to adopt these sustainable practices because consumers are either A, going to buy it versus another brand, or are they willing to pay more for it because sustainability doesn't necessarily always come cheap. And when we were chatting the other day, you mentioned, Euromonitor put out a claim that 65% of consumers don't believe pet sustainability claims. What do you see as the biggest challenges in sustainability in the pet industry? And talk a little bit about, some of the steps that you in working with brands, with the PSC to help resolve them.
Yeah, thanks for that. So yeah, I think the Euro Monitor uh, report that came out, I think it's a few months ago now. They come out every week. There's a brand new one saying about the same things, right? Which is pet parents and people in general are very interested in, reducing the environmental impact of their consumption, and they're really looking to brands to help them do that, right? And I think the inherent answer to your first question, which is, does it make a difference to sales? Are you going to buy a product? Is both yes and no, right? So yes, it will drive some consumers um, to make those purchases. So absolutely, we know that happens. Generally, I think where it does impact more is on the brand loyalty side. So I think ultimately, the pet industry itself benefits from higher levels of brand loyalty than the human food industry, which is also where I do a bunch of work. So I think that answer is yes and no. So if we assume that, based on the Euromonitor um, data, 52% of pet parents are more consider environmental impact, for example, in their pet food choices, um, or want to, is what they're saying. They would do it. But to your point, the difficulty is if those 52% that are potentially willing to pay more, and some will and some won't, right? So some will overreport. There's a bunch of things going on, right? So if 65% of them don't believe what they're buying is more sustainable, then you're really looking at a top 18% of the supply chain of the entire pet food industry. Like, unless you can deal with that, you have a limit to how much sustainable pet food you can do. And the difficulty is that there's not a lot of clarity around it, right? This is sort of, we see this in other parts, other industries that also use animals and animal proteins as part of their business. There's sort of a lack of transparency and traceability. So we're not always sure where by the time you get to retail, consumers are not really sure exactly where things come from. And they don't really, in the absence of clear, consistent messaging from the brands, they're not even really sure what that means sometimes, right? So where you will see people shop in a Whole Foods is because they understand sort of what the brand is, and they can go in there and trust that the brand has dealt with that, right? So you always want to think about um, you want. I used to work in retail. I was a director of operations at a grocery chain in Canada, and we used to talk about people shopping with their eyes closed. So you just want them to go in and just know that they trust that the quality or that the values are aligned and all those sorts of things, and you can just go in and pick it up. So, um, I think for the pet industry itself, the pet food industry, I think we're just sort of starting to get to that phase, right? So it's been the same transition we've seen in other industries, which is first thing we do is we deal with scope one, everything inside our own chain, right? So we're worried about changing to LED light bulbs and all those sorts of things to make sure that our own businesses are sort of, using energy efficiently and all those sorts of things. So now we're starting to see the pet industry coming into sort of the scope three side. So how does our business, what are the impacts of our business on our supply chain? And that's really around animal welfare and people and communities and environmental impact. And 90% of the businesses of a retailer is likely coming out of that supply chain, and 60 to 70% of the impacts into a food manufacturer are likely coming out of that, right? So these are the big chunks. The difficulty being um, that first of all, the supply chain for the pet food industry is a little bit more complex and a little bit more of a black box than it is in the human food chain. We have a lot clearer supply traceability and guide, like we can see it. There's some extra steps in the pet food industry. So I think so to answer your question, very long way. I think we're first starting to see pet it, we've seen niche or smaller brands come in and try to adopt that area. Where we start to see now is the rest of the industry coming in as well. I think there's a bit of concern, a bit of sensitivity around sort of the relationship between farm animals and our pets in people's minds. I think for some people, there's just this whole thing about, I love my dog, my cat, and then I'm feeding these other animals. So I think there's a heightened awareness in the pet industry. So I think that's sort of first thing we're getting there is kind of new. We're starting to see it become more as we start to see some of the more conventional brands start to include sustainability claims. The brands that were already there will need to step up and actually start being very transparent and very clear about what they mean. So I think that's sort of where we are right now in the pet food industry. And my recommendation is always for them to go out and look to other industries, right? So these are big, big, big businesses. There are four major producers and processors in the U.S. And so an individual company or an individual industry is not going to be able to impact that on its own. It really needs to sort of engage with broader stakeholders and with peer companies and with other industries and sort of come to a clear and consistent expectation and definition of what is needed to make sustainability claims on pack. I think once you figure that out, um, you're not aiming for 100% of the population because 100% of the population is not going to want to pay more, to your point. Um, but you want to maximize the percentage of population that's available to you.
Yeah. So you've raised a lot of interesting things there, and I think the one I want to jump into right away, is you talk about the lack of transparency, and we're sort of on the cusp of the pet food industry moving into sustainable production. And what do you see as the most valuable sustainability claims that pet food brands can make? Is it really more around using sustainable packaging? And we've seen everything there from um, you know refillable containers at Petco, to you know advances in polymers and using you know bio-friendly compostable plastic. Or, are we looking more along the lines of ethically and sustainably sourced? Is it more valuable to have a Marine Stewardship Council seal on your pack? Or is it more valuable to say this is grass-fed beef? Or, we've seen, um, again, Canada, they did the refillable tins with Petco, and they've also been kind of at the forefront in terms of advancing regenerative agriculture and the use of regen ag in the pet industry. Um, but I think with a lot of things, I talk to people about regenerative agriculture and they don't necessarily know what it means. People see the MSC logo and that makes them feel good because somebody's saying, okay, this is good for the oceans. But I don't think there's a lot of like deeper understanding on the part of the consumer that they necessarily know what that means. And getting back to, what you talked about with, customers being able to come in and shop with their eyes closed, because we are in this transition stage. I remember a long time ago, one of the things you said that stuck with me is that um, for us to really make sustainability a thing in pet food, we have to acknowledge where we've been unsustainable in the past. We have to be able to admit that some of what we're doing is not adhered to these practices before. Um, so when you come in and you're working with these brands, what are the claims that you tell them to bite off first, and how do you talk to them about reconciling the fact that okay, we haven't been here before, but we're moving here now?
Yeah, so I think a few things. I think there's a difference between products and brands, right? So if you're trying to sell a product, that's one thing. I think ultimately what we've seen change over time is this align with value thing. So we used to think that um, right? So we used to do like materiality assessments when it'd be like, oh, we'll deal with these top ones in the top quarter because they're the most important ones, right? I think the difficulty being is if you are saying that as a brand, you are trying to be more sustainable, you can't have you need to be able to address at least the minimums on everything, right? So you cannot it's hard to imagine that in the near future you're going to be able to go out there and say you're certified humane or MSC certified, but you're using all completely non-recyclable packaging, right? Ultimately, that is going to be a bit of a complex issue that we just haven't seen before, right? So we've been able to put up one or two things because we've been trying to sell products. As we see this move to people aligning their purchasing with with companies and businesses that actually are aligned with their values, that actually becomes more complex. So you don't have to do everything all at the same time because you can't, but you have to recognize everything. And I think where you will come down on what you emphasize and what you start with is really depending on your brand, your product, and what matters to you, right? So with companies I work with, it's not really my job to tell them where to prioritize. I think if I do that, they were not going to implement it. We need to make sure, especially off the jump, that they've got things that they really care about that are important to them. Um, and you still need to do the minimums, right? So still need to make sure that there's not child labor in your supply chain, and you're not contributing to deforestation. You still need to address these things. It just may not be uh, your biggest play at the beginning. And it can even be things like, look, we recognize this is an issue. Um, and we're not looking for a perfect supply chain. We're just looking for an improved supply chain, right? This is a resource intensive industry in plant and in animal protein. And so we're always going to have these negative impacts. But start by working on the things that are important to you and your brand. So if you're a brand that's, all about outdoors, and maybe you want to start thinking about what are my air pollution, what like those are the sorts of things you might want to start environmental. If your brand does a lot of community work, you might want to start checking to make sure what social implications of your supply chain are, right? Like it's really up to the brand, and the brand will have something that they think they can sell. So I think that's kind of it. I think I forgot. So that yeah, so and I think this whole idea of then how do you go back and say, look, we weren't doing this, but we're doing this now. I think we often see um, businesses tend to be very risk averse in this sort of way. Um, and that's because just because of we live in a fairly social media, these sorts of hits happen all the time. We see people having campaigns, but I think the way to think about this is those mea culpas, those oops, we weren't quite where we are, is actually how you build transparency and trust, right? Those are the sorts of things we weren't doing this, but we are now. If a company can be that bold to actually say, look, we got this wrong, we're going to do this now. I think that is absolutely how you align your values with those of these sort of new consumers that we're talking about, those sort of, especially sort of the Gen Zs and younger, those people who are sort of, we're trying to build it, right? So I think that's sort of the trick. That's where it comes. When I worked when I was in grocery, my boss once they went to a one of those Hawaiian retreats, as you do in senior management, and they did one of those coal walks. And reportedly, at the end of it, my boss walked up to one of the guys and said, "Anybody burn? Everybody ever burn their feet when they do these coal walks?" And the guy said, "Yeah, you got to burn somebody once in a while, or this has no value." And I think that's a really interesting thing to keep in mind, that you need to sort of be really clear about when the things you're doing are not what you expected them to be. Um, and say that didn't work and now we're doing this. And I think that is a very reasonable expectation for a business to learn as they go. And I think it's also how you sort of build trust. And there's certainly examples in Canada here. We have a, a pork processor, Maple Leaf Foods, that had an issue with listeria about 10 years ago. And they handled it really, they handled it fairly well. But the third day in, their CEO went on to national news and made commercials and said, "Look, we messed up. We're going to clear this up, and we're going to get back to you." And then they were super transparent and open all the time. And it really, as a brand building, this horrible thing that happened to them actually, from a brand side, was quite, because they managed it well. It turned out they have much better brand trust than they did before, right? And I think the
Right.
only other thing I would suggest is that there are two different reasons why you use trust marks, like MSC and those sorts of things. So if you're a brand with high consumer trust, where people believe you, they're loyal to you, they trust what you say, you use trust marks to verify what you're saying. If you're a brand with low trust, you want to rely on sort of the transparency and credibility of those trust marks. So in that case, you're using the trust mark that relates to the most important things to your brand, but you're using that to give your company credibility as opposed to using it to sort of support your credibility.
Right. No, that makes sense. And and to an extent, I think one of the things that is preventing us from, getting to that full transparency within pet food is there hasn't really been that acknowledgement that, you know, by and large, up until now, this has been a commodity-based system. And so when we talk about something like regenerative agriculture, to really illustrate the benefits, you have to be willing to say what the alternative is, right? Like we can talk about, okay, beef that is raised on regenerative grassland has more nutrient value and it actually creates a carbon sink versus being a, top contributor of methane to the environment in conventional livestock. But like unless you really illustrate like this is what is going on when you raise cows in a conventional meat processing facility versus raising them on regenerative grassland, you're not really articulating the benefits of that sustainability. You're not, giving people that image of like, this is why I should want to pay more. If you only illustrate the benefits and then, just talk about conventional on the other side, you're not really pushing that, same with cage-free chicken, right? What is it like for the chicken that's raised in the cage? And,
Yeah,
um,
yeah, it's a good
and I
question.
think because, still so much of the supply chain, both for human food and for pet food, is reliant on this commodity-based system. People aren't as willing to speak out about the other side of it. Can you talk to that at all, or
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think um, as when I was a retailer, there's absolutely no way I would put out a product that said made without child labor, made with child labor, right? Like you're just not going to do that. And that's complex. And those both of those things are in all of the stores, the pet stores and other stores as well. And same with commodity. Like so there's issues, right? So I think that's the complexity. How do you do that? And I think to your point about regen ag, especially as this is again about transparency, traceability, and sort of aligning it on a value sense, right? So they're going to have to. I think where regen ag is going to have to, and I don't know, explaining the percentage of microbiomes or microbiome availability inside soil or something is like all these crazy things that are super important, like that's going to be really tough to communicate. And especially as we see larger companies coming in and sort of trying to bite off part of regen agriculture, but in a way that is probably not what most of us think about when we think about regen agriculture, right? Just like net zero, where suddenly everybody's net zero, and it may not be the same type of net zero we think about, right? I think, you know, so that's the complexity. I think for regen ag, it's going to have to be about a narrative. I think they're going to have to figure out how you tell the story about the impacts on farmers. So this is the thing, right? So in a commodity system, producers produce on a market base, so supply and demand. You get paid what the market says you get paid. Um, and there's a lot of pressure on producers to ensure that we keep our prices low so that to ensure food affordability, and all they get pushed down onto them. And it might be a coincidence, but I will just again mention that the top four processors are actually recording record profits over the last few years. So really, we're pushing down. So that's making it harder on the producers. I think being able to for the regen folks to talk about what they're doing, because they're actually able to make more decisions about how they do it, right? They're able to say, this is the cow, this we bred this animal because we believe it's going to work best. We've added some genetics from the global south, from the south, because we know that as climate change is hitting, the northern European breeds we've been growing for so long, are not going to be as productive. We need an animal that's better at dealing with heat. So they can talk about all these things that they're doing to actually make these systems work inside. Um, it's really tough. Regen ag is going to be a tough one because the complexity is what matters, and complexity is a really difficult thing to communicate. Uh, to supply chains, to consumers, to anybody else. Like, my God, like every time you go to regen ag thing, we're talking about soil composition, which is super important and a huge impact. But I'm not a marketer, which is good, but communicating that and the value of that. So I think it really has to come back to in
And
regen ag, like we were
communicating
saying
in,
before.
in a way that, yeah, and communicating it in a way that people can look at it and understand, what's that 30-second, you know, view. Yeah, 100%. It's tough. I mean, I feel informed on regenerative agriculture, and I went to Impact Unleashed. I watched Tina Owen's presentation. I brought her on to Pet Working. We had another hour-long chat, and but most people I talk, they don't even know what it is. Like it, and I mean, in the same way, most people don't know what organic means, right? They have a sense. They know it's good. They might be willing to pay more for it, but how do you know, how do you fully articulate everything that goes in to this complex farming approach, um, and then articulate the benefits at the back? I think there needs to be a lot of thought that goes into messaging to the consumer. This is why this matters to you.
Mhm.
Um, and it's a double-sided thing because there's nutritional benefits and there's environmental benefits. And it's like, which I think in the case of their pets, people are still more likely to buy the food that is offering the greater nutritional benefit. That is, that they can say, like, this is going to make a better life for my pet. I don't think the majority of consumers are at the point yet where they're going to make a decision about their pet solely based on how beneficial it is for the. You got to
Yeah.
hit the table stakes of, this is good nutrition for my pet, one, and then okay, maybe the environmental benefits are a secondary factor.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. Nutrition is certainly sort of the bar, right? So you hit that. And then you look at all these sort of attributes that we're starting to see now around calming and uh, food that will help sort of manage some anxiety and food that will help manage like all the gut health and all those other things that are coming out, and that's really great. But you still have to hit nutrition. Just every time you're adding an attribute and you're adding cost, you are kind of limiting the size of your potential audience, right? And that's absolutely fine because you are not going to be able to hit all of those folks. So as a brand, you lead with the ones that are the most important, and that's sort of I think where Regen is trying to figure it out right now. But like we said before, the great thing about Regen is it gives them an opportunity to be transparent about um, the other parts of it. So not only are we dealing with the environmental part, but they have an opportunity to ensure that not only that the people that work on those the producers and their families and anybody that actually works there, has enjoys like a good quality of life and economic well-being, right? We like they have the opportunity to do the whole thing, and I think they need to deal with all of that, and I think they pretty much are, and the animal welfare side too, right? They have a way to ensure. Because as you go into these higher levels, the expectation around regen ag, you're not going to be able to sell regen ag food in a plastic container. It's just not going to work, right? It's just you're going to need to hit all of them. So I think just the expectations as you go, and this is really sort of around how do consumers think about sustainability. They don't want to have to make all of the decisions. They just want all the decisions to be involved where they are, so they can just go and pick it up, right? They just want to shop with their eyes closed. They want to know. I want to know that I want to know Patagonia has it figured out for me. I want to know that IKEA has it figured out for me. I don't want to have to go in and read labels and look at all these different certifications that I don't understand, talking about things that I don't understand. It's not my job. I'm a consumer. I just need to buy things. Right? Like it's a lot to ask. Yeah, so I think the other complexity on the regenetic side is just the general supply chain side, right? So it's great to get producers, and um, that's hard enough. I mean, to your point about organic, organic has been 20 or 30 years, 30, 40 years now. Small percentage of producers have moved there, despite the fact that there are economic reasons to do it. Um, it's a different system than a conventional system, right? So you're managing according to your local conditions as opposed to managing according to in the more intensive or sort of more conventional systems, the systems themselves determine a lot of the work. So the way that the feed is provided is a mechanical system as opposed to on a regen ag system where you need to figure that out. You're trying to figure out where you're getting from the environment, and then how you sort of complement that with concentrated feed. So it's just a bit more. So organic, which is a simpler system to run than a regen ag system, I think last I saw 7 or 8% was about 5, 7%, I think is where we're sitting on producers. So, regen ag is going to be a little bit harder than that. Then you need to go through to a processor that needs to be, or a slaughterhouse that needs to be segregated. And you need to be able to trace that all the way through from the producer through to the supply chain. The byproducts that generally go into pet food then need to go through some sort of further processing, normally a renderer, um, but maybe not. There are other ways to do it, but just there's also not necessarily a supply chain. So not only just a how do we define it, what are we going to pay for it, but also how do we actually get it from animal to consumers. You need to build an entire supply chain that's not necessarily there already.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, having the before early in my career, with the recession, ended up working in the wine industry between my first consulting job and my second consulting job. And I remember, one of the big things for, there's biodynamic certified, organic certified. And you would see some producers, opt to use those trust marks. But at the same time, a lot of them would not opt for organic certification because the stipulations and the regulations of the program tied their hands too much, right? So they would, operate with organic principles, but they wouldn't necessarily lean into organic or biodynamic certification because, God forbid you get an aphid infestation, you can't spray, right? Or, it completely, couldn't be a means of first resort for them, but they didn't want to rob themselves of that means of last resort. And I kind of wonder if you'll see something similar pop up around regen ag where people espouse the principles of it, but don't necessarily go to full certification because then you're just adding another cost component to get that certification, which then gets passed on to the consumer. And I know it's slightly different, but the number of times I had to educate customers around, okay, I know you want organic. This is produced with organic principles, but they haven't opted for certification because it actually makes it so that they can sell the bottle to you for less than what they would if they had to factor in that organic certification. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. I think there's a bunch of things, right? So first of all, the complexity with certification and auditing systems is that they tell you what things are at a certain time, right? So if we're using a certification scheme to reduce the risk in our supply chain, we just have to be really clear about what it does. There are certainly um, companies out there that are setting up more fulsome programs where um, what they will do is work with producers and ensure that they, that it's a constant learning journey. Um, IKEA right now is doing some work with some egg producers in China about helping doing that, right? So instead of just going to an existing certification, again, IKEA, a trusted brand. So when the eggs come in, IKEA can say, this is good. This is what we want, right? So to your point, they don't need to pay for that certification. I think what we're starting to see, and it's probably a long way away, or maybe not, who knows, is to move away from these. Certifications are what we call resource or input dependent, right? So they define what you need to do. What that doesn't necessarily, and what it doesn't necessarily tell you is what the outcome is going to be. And this is especially important for regen ag. So it really can't be, to your point, it can't be a strict certification thing because there's going to be all these other things going on. So there is a move to sort of think about, and I was doing some work with the Global Coalition for Animal Welfare, which is 17 global food companies that are sort of getting together to determine on a global scale what what should we talk to our supply chains about, and it includes the entire supply chain. Tyson, Unilever, Nestle, all those folks. So like everybody's there. So then maybe what we need to do is start just talking about what the outcomes are, right? So to your point, the organic system is this, but you pay a lot to get the certification and the restrictions are there. And what it doesn't allow producers to do is adjust for things, especially on these more extensive systems, right? When you're more dependent on your local environment, your region, what's going on. Those can be really complex for those more extensive systems. Every Gen Ag is certainly there. So there's a lot of talk and a lot of work being done right now on moving some of these things from the input to the outcome. Really, because ultimately all we care about is the outcome, right? So you would still need to put some guardrails in place, but instead of worrying about that, you just worry about the outcomes. So, for example, you can get a certification if you don't do the following things, but your bioavailability in your soil or whatever that metric that they use is this number, right? You can you know you can raise pigs. You can't use sow stalls, but you want to ensure that the mortality rate is this, the injury rate is this, that you know aggression is this, the lameness of is this, right? So there's a real sort of push, hopefully, towards these outcome based, and that's kind of I think how regen's going to have to figure it out because it's so local, so dependent on the breed of animal they use, not just the species, but the breed, right? So am I using a heritage breed? Am I using a hybrid? Am I using a commercial breed? Um, is it, yeah, all those different things. It's just so much more complex that I think we're going to need to start talking about, which I also think is a better, an easier way to communicate to consumers, right? You know, theoretically, one of the impact indicators I could use would be um, insect population or bee population, right? I could say that there's this that there we used to have 100 birds here. Now there's 1,000 birds here. Clearly, that's an outcome.
Right.
So I think that's kind of where we're heading towards. And then,
Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
and the flip side of it is if you don't have the um, certification, again, does that just feed into the idea that, you know, you can slap whatever you want on your label? You can say it's ethically sourced or, sustainably sourced, but, what does that really mean? And I think that probably feeds into, um, that 65% of consumers that don't necessarily trust the claims because there isn't a certification. So it's definitely a double-sided debate. And I'm really interested to see where it goes. Um, but I know, Darren, we talked about I want to get to the work that you're doing in Brazil on the uh, the live pet side of things. But maybe as we transition to that, can you give us a big success story within pet food? It doesn't have to be, name the specific brand if you can't, but um, you know, what are some of the big sustainability wins that you've helped advise on in the pet food space? And then I'd love to get to the work that you were mentioning in Brazil.
yeah. So I think there's actually been quite a bit interesting things happening in pet. I think um, it's early, but for sure. I think so. I've had Earth Animal as a client for the last, I think we met in 2019. Um, and I think for me, the big thing about them has been the way. So again, it's not really my job to tell people where they need to be. I think that's sort of what NGOs do. They're like, this is what you need to do. My job is, okay, what do you want to do and how do you get there? So it's a purpose-driven brand with a real clear understanding of what it is that they want. My role mostly is just help organizing those trillions of thoughts that we all have around sustainability, right? Like, I'm sure you've had this conversation as well when you start talking to brands about traceability. They get so stressed as they start to talk about it because it's just so big, and it's like they want to do all these things and they're not really sure where to start. So I think really my role is just to help organize them, organize their thoughts, help them get a process in place, and then help sort of them manage through that process. So that's what I do. I think Earth Animal's done that really, really well in a way that I wouldn't have expected it. So um, I think the success that we've seen from them is not only in their willingness to make bold commitments and really be ambitious and clear about what they're doing, but also their willingness to go out and engage, right? So it can be resource intensive for a brand like this as they do this. Um, but so they, they go out, they've visited their suppliers, they get to go on farm, they talk to them, they understand what's going on, they spend time with their peer companies. Steffi Volo, their chief impact officer, has joined the U.S. Broiler Welfare Working Group, which is actually a human food industry collaboration that's sort of looking at the welfare and environmental impacts of of broiler chicken production. And I think there's two things that have been great about that. Not only has she been able to see the value that the pet industry can bring to the broader food industry, right? I mean, the animal is the same, right? Like it's not like there's pet food animals and human food animals. It's all the same animal. We often speak about pet food as if it's taking the byproducts, but in most in most economies, agricultural economies, what we see is that the human food side is sort of the break-even side, right? So um, everything that's going to the human food side, the processors will break even on, where they will actually grow their business, become economically sustainable and viable, and actually make some money is really on the selling of the rest of the animal, which can be up to 50% of the weight of that animal. Um, so that contribution in terms of not only using the product, but also the economic impact means that the pet industry is very, very valuable to the agriculture industry, but also to the human food industry. I work with apparel and leather companies, and same thing, right? So we don't want hides coming off pigs and cows and cattle going in, being incinerated or going into, right? So they provide a real value to the economic sustainability, but also the environmental sustainability of this. So they have a real impact to play. So I think that's been really interesting for me to see that. I mean, Steffi is she's a force
She's
of
great.
nature. She's a force of nature.
Great.
She just does everything all the time. But I think, yeah, I think that's sort of the ambition of that organization is completely different, and it starts with the founders, the Goldsteins, and then works all the way through. But because they're so purpose driven, you've seen them gone out again. They're an organization that, in my mind, has good consumer trust, and they're using all these other things just to provide backup to be able to say, we said we did this, this is what we're doing, and we have this, right? And I think really just an interesting thing. So um, big props to them. I actually, speaking of Brazil, Steffi came a couple of years ago to a symposium on sustainable agriculture in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and spoke about Earth Animal and their work and the PSC. Um, and yeah, one of the groups I work with, an advisor on, is called COBEA, which I'm not doing the Portuguese, but it's Brazilian Animal Welfare and Sustainable Ag working group that includes I think seven food companies from the franchise holder of Pizza Hut and KFC to two of the largest producers. There's an organic egg producer, but there's also, and the president of this organization is actually from a pet brand, and so Superdog. So I mean, it's just been really great to see. I think the pet food industry has a bigger role to play in this. And again, the pet food industry is not going to do this on their own. And that's nothing against them. It's just these are large businesses. Um, and so, yeah, that's been really interesting in the last 7 years now that I've been sort of aligned to the pet industry.
That's awesome. And you were also mentioning down in Brazil, you've recently had a big win working with one of the largest pet retailers down there, helping them migrate away from selling breed breeder raised dogs in their stores to only facilitating adoptions of shelter dogs through the stores, but also then working them to identify breeders that have been certified so that pet parents that want to make sure that they're getting a breed specific dog can get a dog that has been raised according to a in an ethical and responsible manner.
Yeah,
You want to
yeah,
talk a little
that's
bit
been
about that?
yeah, it's been super interesting. They haven't announced it yet, so I won't name the brand, but a very large multi sort of a I believe it's across Brazil. A lot of very large locations. So Brazilians will know it's one of two. It's just such a big company. And yeah, so again, they had chosen to um, for whatever reason, internally chosen to stop selling animals from breeders and to move towards adoption. And adoption rates in Brazil are quite a bit lower than they are. They're just at a different part of that journey. Um, so again, look, not an adopted dog is not for everybody. They're not everybody wants one. That's not what they want. And I just like as an organization, I'm just really impressed by this. So as a next step, they said, okay, look, we have these customers. These customers are important to us, but the lives, the health, and welfare of animals is very important to us too. So what we want to be able to do is, if somebody comes in and says, I want a insert breed name here, what do we do to make sure that that they can go to a place and feel comfortable that 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 they're being bred within sort of the limitations of the animals, and that that they're experiencing the type of welfare and health access and welfare that we need, right? And it's not to say that not everybody's doing it. It's just these sort of certification schemes. There's large differences between the highest and the lowest. I think these sort of certifications just kind of they don't bring the top down, but they bring that up. They just sort of like smallen that a little bit, right? Which is great. Smallen is a word we will all use now. So yeah, it's been really interesting. I mean, we've had uh, support from last year, actually in December, I think the European Union released a draft proposal for a directive um, addressing the breeding and care of dogs and cats, which we've never seen anywhere. And it's really quite interesting and worth a read. And it does a bunch of things. And one of the things it does that's really interesting is that it requires breeders to microchip, which is just such a brilliant thing to do. And it restricts transportation and it's got requirements and stuff. So again, those sorts of directives are good as reference points. But I think what that says, if I'm a pet food company that if I'm a pet retailer that sells live animals, that you know, I think again back to my life in grocery, which I seem obsessed with today, but it was a long time ago. But there used to be this sense that the businesses were completely separate. Then we went through this category management thing where we started to intertwine our businesses. And I think now there's a recognition through the European Sustainable Reporting Standards, through SASB, through all these other reporting frameworks, through the SEC regulations in the US, the regulations on child labor and the impacts of deforestation, all these other things we're starting to see. There's just this new focus on supply chain impact. So outside of our own business, but what we impact through our business relationships. I think that's been really interesting. And I think that's what's sort of driven this Brazil thing. So I think if I were elsewhere in the world, I would start to think about, is this something that's currently happening, right? And also, instead of just being a health issue, because normally these sorts of pets have been, either part of our agriculture side, and really just dealt with from a health and disease spread thing, as opposed to now this more fulsome of what matters to the animal. How do we ensure, uh, you know, ultimately, we're starting to see breeds being outlawed in Denmark, for example. Like things are just really changing for the fact that we bred them to the point that they have sort of issues that, according to the Danish government, is not uh, is not good for the health or the welfare of the animal. So we're starting to see all these changes, and I think that this Brazilian pet industry approach to it is just the retailers approach is just absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, no, it's really cool. I think it addresses again, a lot of what we talked about today was sustainability, but you know, I often say, we want to do the best for our animals. We want to do the best for them in terms of nutrition, in terms of care. Um, if we don't take care of the planet, it doesn't matter how well we take care of our animals. And so, I think the work that you're doing on the sustainability side is incredibly important. But on the flip side of things, if you know, we can't forsake the well-being of the people and animals that live on the planet right now. Um, to focus on the long-term sustainability of the planet. So, it's great to see the breadth of the work that you're doing, and really cool. We're big champions of animal adoption here at Pet Working. We've had lots of episodes. From rescuing dog beaches of Brazil. Early on, we did an episode on the state of shelter adoption with Hills and Shelter Animals Count back a couple months ago. We've had Rescue Spot on. They have a great platform here in the US for uh, pet adoption, and give people the ability, if you are looking for a certain breed of dog, to search across the country to potentially find it. Not to say that animals that come from breeders are a bad thing. I certainly understand and appreciate people's preference for given breeds. We could probably launch into a whole another episode here on what you just identified with the Danish and outlawing certain breeds, because you know we do see, whether it's hip dysplasia in humans or breathing issues with French bulldogs, uh, it does raise the question, are we playing God a little bit too much? And you know,
Sure.
they're not questions that I'll pretend to have an answer for, but it is important to note that some governments are, recognizing these as problems, and if like you said, with the European Union statement on breeder certification, up in one part of the world, it may be a model that other people follow. So I think very important for you know pet retail, pet nutrition, pet parents. That they're things that people should be paying attention to for sure.
Yeah, and I would just say from an industry side, right? By the time you get to the point that you're fighting legislation, you've maybe lost the plot a bit, right? You have an opportunity, and this is, I think, a really great example, right? And so um, we see a lot of municipalities sort of passing bylaws out that prohibit the sale of bred dogs from breeders in pet stores, right? I think there's by the time you get to the legislative point, you're kind of done. There's an opportunity for you to think about these sorts of things, right? So if you do want to sell animals in your store that are from breeders, what do you do to make sure things are going to change and you're not always going to win that. But what do you do beforehand to make sure you don't get to the point that it's legislation? Is always the trick, right? We see these broader trends and we see these movements coming. We can see them like, they're all over to your point. They don't come out of nowhere. Um, so if I'm a pet retailer, um, I know that there's a World Pet Association health guide, which isn't available to the public for some reason. But anyway, I mean that sort of thing around transparency, right? So figure it out. What are the issues people are worried about? How do I address that inside my own supply chain? Is this an animal I should be keeping, right? So why do we not sell pythons, right? Like this is a good example. Like, what does that look like? So you don't want to. So they don't sell pythons because they know that that would be bad, and there would be legislation and all the reasons, right? So just think about, there's an opportunity in advance of that to avoid that sort of bylaw legislation, which is always complex because you have no control over it. You don't want your business legislated. The benefit being that everybody is on the same, that sort of takes away that disadvantage of being the first mover, but you don't have any say. You don't have any control of it. And they are very rarely improvements. It's always, legislation tends to like either be nothing or really harsh when it comes in. So there's a really good opportunity right now. If I were an organization that sold pets, I would certainly be looking at, so what are the, what are the NGOs saying? What are our customers saying, right? So when our customers walk into our stores and they see the beta fish in those tiny little cups, how often are our poor employees hearing about this, and what are the people saying, and what can we do about it? So I think just take these things as examples, knowing that it's going to take you years to figure this out, and years in your supply chain. And back to this whole trust thing that we started with, that's okay, but just be transparent about it. Identify what your issues are. That's what you have websites for. That's what you have annual reports for. Put it all in there. We did this. We thought we would get here, but we didn't get here because of these things. But we're going to continue to try to do it. Or we realized that the impact of this was too big, and we're just not going to do it anymore. But just really be transparent about it.
Now, and I will say I think you said everything right there. So I'll go back to what you what you said at the beginning. I don't know that I can say it any better than that. But Darren, no, this has been a fantastic conversation. I'm glad we were able to touch on so many different points, and I think it just illustrates how much sustainability and animal welfare underpins everything that we do. So Darren Vanstone, Managing Director of Ocatra, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. Darren, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks so
And
much for having me. It's been great.
absolutely. I'm Peter Kenseth with Petworking, everyone, and we will see you on another episode again soon. Take care.